They said the Halberts never left their home, not even after death. Neighbors whispered that the mansion on Hollow Creek never truly emptied, that every window concealed a watcher, every wall hummed with the breath of something that should have long been silent. When the estate was finally opened after years of abandonment, what investigators found inside was so grotesque, so utterly unholy, that the entire town of Brindleford refused to let the place stand. But before the fire, before the erasure, before the legends grew, there was a family, proud, devout, and desperate to escape the one thing even wealth couldn't save them from: mortality. The Halbert mansion had stood for over a century, its walls dark with smoke and secrets. Visitors described an unnatural stillness, a chill that clung to your skin and followed you long after you left. Yet within those walls, the Halberts dined, prayed, and slept beneath portraits of their ancestors who never left their side. It was said that each time a Halbert died, the house grew quieter, yet never emptier. Servants quit without warning. Guests vanished between dusk and dawn. And still, the family carried on as if nothing had happened, as if the dead remained part of their daily life. But then came Clara Halbert, young, curious, and burdened with a sense that her home was watching her. Late at night, she would hear footsteps pacing through the west corridor, the faint dragging of a dress, the soft tapping of fingers against her bedroom door. When she called out, there was no reply, only the sound of slow breathing from the other side. And when she finally dared to look beneath the floorboards of the old parlor, she uncovered the truth her family had spent generations protecting. The Halberts had never buried their dead because to them death was not an ending. It was an invitation. It began with a sound, so faint at first that most dismissed it as the groaning of old wood, the settling of a house long past its prime. But the noises didn't stop. They came at odd hours, low and deliberate, as though the mansion itself were breathing. The Halbert mansion had always been unsettling, but this was different. The whispers were soft, intimate, like voices drifting through the walls, murmuring names that no one alive remembered. At first, Clara thought she imagined them. She'd wake in the dead of night to hear the faint rhythm of footsteps pacing just beyond her room, dragging and halting, followed by a sigh that seeped through the plaster. The servants heard it too, but refused to speak of it. When she asked, they'd glance nervously at one another, muttering prayers before retreating down the hall, pretending the sound wasn't real. But it was real, so real that even in the daylight, she could feel it beneath her feet, a faint vibration, as though something living was moving deep within the house. Her mother insisted it was rats in the walls, though the manor had been sealed for years. Her father grew furious at the mere mention of it, demanding silence whenever the subject arose. "This house is old," he'd say sharply. "It remembers things, that's all." But the memory he spoke of seemed far too alive. One night, Clara pressed her ear against the wallpaper in the west corridor, the one everyone avoided, and nearly screamed. Behind the wall, she could hear a voice humming an old hymn, low and broken, the same song her grandmother used to sing before she died. The sound stopped the instant she pulled away, leaving behind a suffocating silence, heavier than before. From then on, she could never walk that hallway alone. The air was different there, thick and cold, and every shadow seemed to pulse when she passed. The staff began to vanish one by one. First the housekeeper, then the butler, then a maid who was last seen carrying linens down to the cellar. The family told the townsfolk they had left for better work, but their belongings remained untouched, their beds still made, as though they had simply dissolved into the house itself. Clara started to keep a candle beside her bed at all times, terrified of waking to the sound of those voices calling her name in the dark. She began to notice small things moving on their own, doors creaking open even when bolted shut, portraits shifting slightly on their hooks, curtains fluttering when no wind blew. At dinner, the family would eat in silence, pretending not to hear the faint tapping that echoed through the walls between each bite, a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat buried alive. One stormy evening, Clara followed the sound. It led her to the grand staircase, where the walls quivered faintly, dust falling from the edges, as though something behind them was trying to push through. The humming began again, softer now, almost pleading. When she pressed her hand to the wood, she felt warmth, not the warmth of the firelight or the air, but the warmth of flesh. She stumbled back, heart racing, certain she had touched something human. The next morning, she begged her father to let her leave, but he only stared at her with cold eyes and said, "You'll learn to live with it, just as we all have." That was when she realized the truth she had been avoiding. The Halberts knew exactly what lived in those walls, and the sounds that haunted her weren't echoes of the past. They were the dead themselves, still there, still awake, and still waiting to be remembered, or worse, set free. The discovery of the locked cellar door happened by accident, though later Clara would swear something had guided her there. The Halbert mansion had dozens of rooms, but none as avoided as the cellar. It was said to flood in the spring and freeze in the winter, a damp, lightless place filled with the stench of decay. No one ever went down there after dusk. The servants carried coal and preserved food in daylight only, always returning pale and silent. One rainy afternoon, while chasing a loose candle that had rolled under the stairwell, Clara noticed a section of the floor she had never seen before. A narrow seam in the wooden planks, almost invisible under years of dust. Curiosity drove her to scrape at it, and beneath a layer of rot she found a handle. It wasn't polished brass like the others in the house, but iron, cold and rough, stained with something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. When she tugged, it didn't move. It wasn't a trapdoor at all, but the top edge of a sealed entrance leading deeper underground. Her heart pounded as she pressed her ear against it. There was a sound, a faint dripping, then a soft thud, rhythmic and deliberate, like something shifting in the dark below. She rushed to tell her father, but his reaction chilled her more than the discovery itself. His face drained of color. His hands trembled slightly, and then he forced a laugh that sounded hollow. "You mustn't go near that part of the house again," he said. "It's dangerous. Old support beams, unstable flooring." When she insisted she had found a door, he raised his voice for the first time in years, commanding her never to mention it again. That night, he had the cellar door bolted from the inside and ordered 2 servants to move a heavy cabinet over it. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was down there had already heard her. Days passed before she dared to return. The storm outside had left the mansion trembling, and the usual murmurs in the walls had grown louder, more urgent. Late one night, unable to sleep, she slipped from her room with a lantern and crept toward the cellar stairs. The cabinet was still there, but something had changed. The faint smell of formaldehyde hung in the air, a sharp, chemical sweetness that burned her throat. When she touched the handle, it was wet. Rust should have made it rough, but it felt slick, freshly oiled, as though someone had used it recently. With trembling hands, she wedged a fire poker between the latch and the frame, prying it open inch by inch until the hinges screamed in protest. A rush of cold air spilled out, heavy and damp, carrying the unmistakable scent of death. The lantern flickered violently, and for a moment she thought she heard movement below, the shuffle of bare feet, a whisper, the faint clink of glass jars. The staircase spiraled into darkness, and the further she descended, the colder it grew, until she could see her breath misting in front of her. The walls were lined with shelves, all empty, save for a few broken bottles and rusted instruments that looked more like surgical tools than anything used for storage. At the end of the corridor stood another door, smaller, made of iron and covered in strange etchings that looked like symbols or prayers. Her light trembled as she raised it, revealing smudged handprints across the metal, pressed deep as if by someone desperate to get out. When Clara finally backed away, something inside the darkness whispered her name. Not shouted, not moaned, whispered, soft and clear, the voice of a child she didn't recognize. The lantern went out, plunging her into blackness. She bolted up the stairs, tripping and scraping her knees, slamming the door behind her. When she finally emerged into the faint morning light, she found her father waiting at the top of the steps, his face expressionless. "You went down there, didn't you?" he said quietly. And when she didn't answer, he simply sighed, eyes hollow, and whispered, "Then it knows you now." The morning after she opened the cellar, Clara couldn't stop thinking about what she'd heard. That voice, faint, familiar, and impossibly close, echoed in her head long after the house had fallen silent again. Sleep became a cruel thing. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the iron door and the handprints pressed against it. Her father had sealed the cellar once more, this time with heavy chains, but Clara knew that no lock in the world could contain what lingered down there. The whispers in the walls had grown louder, clearer, forming words now instead of sounds. They spoke in fragmented sentences, half memories and half moans. And then came the smell. It started faintly, a sour, chemical odor drifting through the vents. Soon it filled the entire western wing, clinging to the curtains and the bedding, a blend of rot and preservation fluid. No matter how many candles were lit, it never went away. Clara decided to find out where it came from. Late one night, guided by nothing but instinct and the faint hum in the floorboards, she followed the scent through the old parlor, where the portraits of the ancestors hung crooked and watchful. The eyes in those paintings always seemed to follow her, glassy and fixed with something that looked like warning or guilt. As she stepped closer to the hearth, the boards beneath her creaked, hollow and uneven. She knelt, brushing away layers of dust, until her fingers traced the outline of a hatch she had never seen before. Her pulse quickened. She pried it open with a knife, and what wafted out made her gag. It was the same smell from the cellar, only stronger, fresher. She lowered her lantern and saw a ladder descending into blackness. The air below was thick and humid, and as she climbed down, the faint light revealed something that made her chest seize. Rows of chairs, wooden, old-fashioned, lined the narrow room, each occupied by what looked at first like mannequins. But they weren't mannequins. They were bodies, preserved, dressed in finery, faces pale and waxen, eyes clouded yet open. Their mouths were slightly parted as if mid-conversation. Their fingers were folded neatly in their laps. It took Clara several seconds to recognize the faces. They were her family, the great-uncles, the aunts, the cousins she had seen in portraits but never met. All perfectly still, perfectly kept, as though waiting for the next family dinner. Her knees gave out, the lantern shaking violently in her grip. The air smelled of death and formaldehyde, of flowers long decayed. She stumbled backward, trying not to make a sound, but the slightest touch of her hand sent one of the corpses rocking forward. Its head tilted, and a soft, dry breath escaped its lips, a sigh too human to be imagined. Clara bit back a scream, watching as the body's cloudy eyes seemed to follow her. The silence in the room grew heavier, thick enough to feel against her skin. She turned to flee, but her lantern light caught something at the far end, a small table with a teacup, still half full, and beside it, a child-sized chair. Her heart froze. In that chair sat a little girl, no older than 10, her dress yellowed with age, her curls pinned neatly, her eyes dull but unblinking. In her hands was a porcelain doll with half its face missing. Clara took a shaky step forward, and the girl's head moved, slow and jerky, turning just enough for their eyes to meet. Clara screamed then, stumbling backward into one of the other bodies, knocking it over. The sound it made wasn't the thud of something dead. It was the soft, sickening sound of something breaking open. She scrambled up the ladder, the stench burning her lungs, and slammed the hatch shut behind her, gasping for air. But even after she escaped the hidden room, the house no longer felt empty. The silence was gone, replaced by faint rustling below the floorboards, as though dozens of stiff hands were shifting slowly, reaching upward, eager to feel the light once more. In the days following her discovery of the unburied room, Clara couldn't stop shaking. She avoided her parents, barely ate, and kept her door locked at all times. Her dreams were feverish and filled with whispers, voices that murmured the same words over and over. He promised we'd never leave. The sound of footsteps echoed in the halls at all hours, but when she ran to look, no one was there. The servants had all gone by then, and the mansion had fallen into a strange, uneasy quiet, the kind that felt alive. One night, desperate for answers, Clara snuck into her father's study, a place she'd been forbidden to enter since childhood. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of old candle wax. She searched through drawers and cabinets, finding only ledgers, sermons, and brittle family records. But in the bottom drawer of the desk, wrapped in black cloth, was a book. A small, leather-bound journal, marked with the initials R.H. for Reverend Halbert, her great-grandfather. She opened it with trembling hands, and the first page was written in a tight, deliberate script that spoke of devotion, grief, and something else, obsession. It began as a preacher's journal, full of scripture and reflections on the soul. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The Reverend wrote of losing his wife and son to fever, and how he refused to accept their absence. He believed the soul could not ascend if the body was not whole. That burial severed the connection between the living and the divine. He began experimenting with preservation, documenting strange rituals and prayers said to anchor the soul within its earthly vessel. His words grew more desperate with each entry, claiming he could still hear his wife's voice after she was gone, that her hand would brush his in the night. "They are not dead," one entry read, the ink smeared by tears or sweat. "They are waiting to be remembered, to be kept." As Clara read on, the Reverend's faith transformed into madness. He described a binding ritual, one that required blood, his own, to keep the spirits tethered to their bodies. He wrote of hearing their breathing in the cellar, of the warmth that returned to their skin, of their eyes fluttering as if trying to wake. The more he wrote, the less he spoke of God, and the more he spoke of eternity. "The flesh," he wrote, "is the soul's final prayer." Clara's stomach twisted as she turned to the final pages, where sketches filled the margins, diagrams of human anatomy, jars filled with organs, instructions for embalming. And then came the line that made her blood run cold. "Each Halbert shall remain with us, kept in love and purity, until the end of the bloodline. Only then shall the house rest." She slammed the book shut, heart pounding, realizing that what she had found beneath the floorboards wasn't a mistake or a hidden shame. It was a legacy. The Halberts hadn't simply refused to bury their dead. They had made it a sacred duty to keep them near. It wasn't grief. It was ritual. The family's wealth had funded decades of secret preservation, passing from one generation to the next like scripture. Her father must have known. Her mother, too. It was all there in the journal. Their responsibility to tend to the bodies, to replace the chemicals, to ensure no decay ever touched them. Clara felt the bile rise in her throat as she understood why her father had reacted with such fury when she'd opened the cellar door. She had broken the chain, disturbed the balance, awakened what was meant to remain suspended between life and death. The journal slipped from her fingers, landing open on the floor. The last entry was dated the year of her birth, and beneath the Reverend's handwriting was another, shakier one, her father's. It read only 3 words: "The ritual continues." The storm began just before midnight, a violent torrent that shook the house to its foundations. The Halbert mansion had endured countless tempests, but this one felt different. It felt purposeful, as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash something foul from the earth. The lightning struck so close that the windows rattled in their frames, and the air inside turned heavy and electric. Clara sat in her room clutching the Reverend's journal to her chest, every boom of thunder echoing like a heartbeat through the walls. The whispers had returned, but this time they weren't confined to the walls or the cellar. They came from everywhere, rising and falling like a chorus of the damned. She could hear footsteps racing down the corridors, doors slamming open on their own, and faint sobbing beneath the floorboards. Then the scent came, sweet, cloying, unmistakable, the same formaldehyde that clung to the preserved bodies below. It was stronger now, filling her lungs, seeping through the vents like poison. She knew what it meant. The room beneath the floor was no longer sealed. Clara grabbed the lantern and ran toward the parlor, her bare feet slapping against the cold marble. The air was alive with motion, curtains fluttering though every window was closed, portraits swaying violently as if shaken by unseen hands. When she reached the parlor, the hatch she had once discovered lay wide open, its hinges bent and warped. The smell that drifted out made her gag, but curiosity and terror drove her forward. She lowered the lantern and gasped. The chairs she had seen before were empty. The bodies that had been sitting so still were gone. Only faint impressions remained in the dust where they once sat, and the air shimmered with movement. Something brushed past her arm, soft and cold, like the hem of a dress. She turned and saw them, the figures she had found days earlier, now moving through the shadows, stiff but deliberate, their cloudy eyes fixed on her. Their mouths hung open, exhaling faint sighs that sounded almost like words. She stumbled back, clutching the Reverend's journal as though it could protect her, but the house was alive now, thrumming with power. The walls groaned as if breathing, and the chandelier above began to sway. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single voice, a man's voice, her great-grandfather's. "Blood of mine," it said, echoing through the hall. "The promise is broken." Clara screamed, dropping the lantern, which shattered on the floor, spilling fire across the boards. The flames caught instantly, feeding on the dry wood and old fabric, and the room lit up in a hellish glow. The figures didn't recoil from it. They moved through the fire without hesitation, faces melting and reforming, skin cracking like wax. Her father appeared in the doorway, eyes wide, his face pale as ash. "You've done it," he whispered. "You've set them free." The storm outside howled in sync with the fire's roar, and the entire mansion seemed to convulse, timbers snapping, glass shattering as though the very structure rejected the evil festering within it. Clara ran, choking on smoke, the journal still clutched in her hands. She could hear them behind her, the footsteps of her ancestors, the scraping of fingernails against the walls, the laughter of children who hadn't drawn breath in decades. She reached the grand staircase only to see the portraits of her family burning, their painted eyes liquefying into dark rivulets that ran down the frames. Each face seemed to twist into agony, mouths opening wide in silent screams. At the top of the stairs, her mother stood motionless, hair hanging in wet strands over her face. "It was meant to last forever," she whispered, before turning to ash as the flames engulfed her. Clara burst through the front doors just as the roof collapsed, the storm's rain dousing her as fire consumed everything behind her. She fell to her knees on the muddy ground, clutching the soaked journal, watching as generations of her cursed family turned to smoke and embers. For a moment it seemed over, but then she heard it again, faint and close, a whisper rising from the journal itself. "It isn't done," it said. "You are one of us." Her trembling fingers loosened, and the book fell open to a blank page, where fresh words began to appear in dripping black ink. The ritual continues through her. Lightning split the sky above, illuminating the smoldering ruins of the house, and in the distance, through the haze and rain, she thought she saw movement, figures standing among the ashes, waiting, watching, ready to come home once more. So if you want to hear what happens next, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.